brought before Agrippa and Bernice, his sister. The way they're presented in the text, before I actually looked up who they were, it seems like when they're introduced that they would be husband and wife, but they're brother and sister. And just to kind of give a little background information on what you're dealing with there, Festus, the guy who's bringing Paul before Agrippa and Bernice, Festus is the ruler from 59 to 62 AD, the governor of Judea. And so that kind of gives us a time frame. It's about 59 AD when this is happening. We don't know too much about him. He seems to be a fairly good ruler. He deals very quickly with legal matters. He's not drawing things out like Felix was before him. And he does seem to be a skillful negotiator. He does a good job at kind of keeping peace between the Romans and the Jews. Agrippa II is the son of Herod, who died in 44 AD. You can see that back in Acts chapter 12. And when his father died, he was, how old was he? He was about 15, I think, if I'm doing the math right in my head. And Claudius, the emperor at the time, knew him very well. He had been in Rome and thought he was too young to be the king, so he sent him somewhere else. And he winds up coming back to the region around this time. And he'll live to be an old man. He's good friends with Vespasian, with Titus, with Domitian. So he is he runs in a very powerful social circle. Bernice, his sister, is incredibly wealthy, and so she is also influential. She is a queen. She was married to the king of Chalcis, and so she's kind of influential too. And so when they're coming, even though they seem to be kind of relatively minor people, at least in the narrative that we get in the Bible, they are pretty significant historical figures in the Judean area, at least. Very powerful, very influential people. And so it's, Paul is standing before a very important audience. Any other information you guys have?
Stephen, why is he referred to as a king? Most of the rulers we read about are called governors or procurators or something like that. So what's the significance of him being called a king?
When Bernice's husband dies, so Bernice is married to the king of Chalcis. I can't remember his name right now. When he dies, Claudius appoints Agrippa king of Chalcis. And so there was some speculation that maybe Bernice kind of hurried her husband's death along in order to kind of get the family more involved. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that anybody could know. But he's also Nero, the Emperor Nero, will give him power over the territories of Galilee, Tiberias, and some other places that are close to the Judean area. So that's why he gets called a king, is he actually is a king over the region of Chalcis, which is, if I remember right, is northeast of Judea.
Well, Agrippa, great-grandfather, was Herod, that in an attempt to eliminate Jesus, had all the babies killed. And so when you go down through their legacy, they've got a DNA which is not really exciting if you're Paul. But when it gets over to Paul, I think he kind of he surprises his legacy.
And getting back to Don's question, it just seems like that in some of these cases, these were legacy titles, almost like today we have dukes and duchies and all these kinds of things that are basically meaningless, except there's some sort of title that somebody had. And so I get the sense with the Idumean kings, the Herod line, that was more of a legacy title than anything else. They certainly fit square in the middle of the Roman government at this point. But it's interesting that there were lots of governors, proconsuls, and procurators that weren't Idumeans as well. So
Yeah, my understanding is that his role is more like a governor. If he were a Roman, it would be governor. So you're probably right, Tim. It's probably honorary more than anything else. He is certainly not independent of the Roman Empire in any way. All right, so with that kind of background, let's just dive into the text, and we'll look at verses 13 through 22, where you kind of get introduced to them, and Festus is going to kind of give them a little bit of the background of what's going on. So, is there anything in that section, verses 13 through 22, that caught your attention or you thought was interesting?
He seems to give a fairly straightforward account of the situation. He doesn't embellish it that I can tell much. He kind of tells it like it is. So he seems to be fairly straightforward.
yeah, I think the key moment in all of this is verses 18 and 19, where he basically said, look, as mad as they were at this guy, I expect them to have some kind of terrible charges against him. And instead they had a disagreement about their law and about some dead man named Jesus who Paul said was still or was alive. I mean, that really sort of sums it up. It's going to be at the core of the discussion and probably a big reason why Paul's going to say down in verse 8 of chapter 26, what he says to, what he will say to Agrippa about, should it be a surprise that I'm talking about a resurrection?
I, it's almost comical the way that Festus talks about that. You can, at least I can, I can hear the disbelief in his voice. A dead man who Paul claims is alive. It's the idea of a resurrection is silly to a Roman.
It it fits with the narrative too that Felix would not be very understanding of the Jews in general, but certainly of the this idea that there's someone named Jesus that is the Savior, and the whole concept behind the Jews looking for a Savior. So it fits that narrative, and the fact that Agrippa says, I would like to hear him, kind of points to his understanding probably better with him and his sister of the Jews in general and their knowledge of the Jewish nation or the ways of the Jews, so to speak.
What about in verse 18 and into 19, where you were talking about that, Eric, and you guys, some of the questions raised against him were basically about the resurrection or belief in the resurrection. So does that lead you to believe that some of the accusing Jews were of the Sadducees instead of Pharisees?
Probably so.
Yeah, it could be, or it could be. But some things that Paul's going to say in the 26th chapter is almost like these guys really do agree with me on the idea of resurrection. I think that the argument Paul's going to make is more that specifically it's Jesus that they want to deny, not the idea of resurrection entirely. But yeah, there definitely would have been some of them who would have made fun of the resurrection. But I don't think that the chief priest would have been one of those guys. I'm not sure.
But the other thing that I think we're going to see is Paul agreeing as to why they were upset with him is teaching to the Gentiles. I mean, that was that was kind of the gist of this. And again, the fact that Agrippa takes on this case, so to speak, of wanting to hear him, I find that really interesting because it's kind of getting in the weeds, right, with the Jews and their belief system, and so that's kind of interesting from my perspective.
somebody mentioned it earlier. I don't remember who it was, but maybe something I forgot to mention about Agrippa and Bernice is they are Idumean, so they're from Esau's lineage, but they are extremely interested in Judea and Hebrew religion in general. Bernice, I think it's her third husband. It's hard to keep track. She has a rough life, and so when you read through her biography, she has a rough life. It's her third husband. She actually asks, and I don't want to say forces, but really encourages him to be circumcised. So they're pretty in tune with what is going on, which does make sense. Somebody said earlier why they would be interested, why they would want to know, because they seem to be very in tune and interested with what's going on in Hebrew religion. All right, so let's, unless there's any other comments, we can go on to the next section. Let's look at verse 23 down through 27. And what did you guys notice in there? I thought it was interesting how they come into the meeting. It's almost like the president is showing up to something. You have the band is out, the military presence is there, all the prominent people from the city have come. Quite an event for the Apostle Paul's. I don't know if it's a trial, but maybe a deposition.
One thing in particular that kind of stands out to me, and this really isn't unique to this particular passage because it happens often in the Old Testament too, but it's really repetitive. We're going to see Paul's account for the third time, I think, in Acts of his conversion. And also you've got Festus kind of repeating himself from 25 as far as the context of what Paul's about to get up and talk about and why he's there.
It's almost like Festus is saying, you know, I'm going to feel like an idiot sending this guy to appear before Caesar, and I don't even know what to say about it. So, you know, help me out here. You know the ins and outs of this kind of stuff, but Caesar's not going to have any interest whatsoever in these arguments between different factions of the Jews. So I need some help here.
And it is interesting to note that the emperor's court is very busy. Roman citizens are appealing to the emperor all the time. And I think you're exactly right. It would have been embarrassing, and maybe even get him in trouble if he sends people to the court, you know, for seemingly flippant or nonsensical reasons. And I think that comes up later down where Festus kind of cries out, you know, your great learning is driving you mad. It's almost like he's afraid he's going to have to send a madman to go stand before Caesar, and he doesn't want to do that either. And so, yeah, I agree.
Stephen, just a question related to Romans being able to come before such high positioned individuals and petition their case or have a deposition, as you talked about earlier. Talk a little bit about how common that was, and what, you know, was that seen in other cultures or other governments that were before or after, you know, Rome, and was that something that was common?
I don't know about other cultures, like in the Babylonian cultures and things. I'm not very familiar with their judicial system. But in Rome, it is where I have most of my experience, most of the research I've done. It's a lot more common than we might think. It's a lot like the district courts in ours. How if you just look at the docket for the district courts, they're flooded, and the procurators or the governors are kind of like the first step in that federal district court system. And so a governor is going to spend quite a bit of his time entangled in legal matters. He'll have, of course, have other people working for him, but a Roman citizen would have the right of appeal to the highest local official. And if the local official felt like the case was worthy and an appeal was made, it could be sent on to Caesar. And it happened a lot with business dealings, with military personnel. Sometimes things would wind up getting appealed to Caesar. There was one writer who said something about the Caesar's court, that if Caesar himself sat at the court, always, he showed up sometimes, but if he was there, that he would do nothing but sit in the court. And so it was a very similar to our judicial system, where it's full. And so this appeal, when we look at it and we talk about, you think about how many years Paul spends in prison with Felix and then Festus, and then in Rome, how long he's going to wait in Rome. It's very similar to our court system. You might have a case in federal court that's there for years, and it would be the same.
It's interesting. They didn't point to judges to do. Maybe they had judges. I don't know.
There were in Caesar's court. I mean, he had to have other people kind of sit. But anything that wasn't just, clear, it would actually, they would kind of write a brief, and it would actually be brought before him, and he could decide. But that was only for Roman citizens. Not anybody could do that. So you had to be a citizen. Any other thoughts there? It seems pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and go to 26, where we're going to get Paul. He's given permission to speak, and then he's going to make his defense. And Tim Matheny had some interesting notes where he had compared the two accounts that Paul gives. And so Tim, if you want to talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So the genesis of this, a few weeks ago, we did Acts 22 and just sort of asked the question, well, how is it that this story gets recounted after being told to us historically? How does it get recounted twice after that? That's really unusual. And so, we said, well, we'll have to come back to it when we get to chapter 26. And so as just looking at the text, I'm convinced that the real key to that is the difference in the way the story is told between chapter 22 and chapter 26. And it really kind of just reveals that there's a significant difference between the audience and the purpose of Paul's discussion here. And if you remember in chapter 22, he's talking to the Jews, making a defense to the Jews themselves. And here it's a lot different, because now he's talking to the Romans or to Festus and Agrippa, and it's a different kind of setup. But a couple of things that I notice from that in chapter 26, unlike chapter 22, there's no establishment really of Paul's credentials, except his credentials as somebody who was persecuting Christians, but nothing that would say, oh, I was this kind of a Jew, because it's not really necessary in front of these external rulers. In 26, the thing that's front and center here is the mission to the Gentiles. And really, I think that this is Paul basically legally establishing the real reason the Jews wanted him dead, was that they didn't want him talking to Gentiles. In chapter 22, of course, he doesn't even introduce that until the very end of his speech. And that is the end of the speech, because the Jews start a riot. And one of the things that strikes me most, though, is in 26, it's the vision on the road to Damascus rather than Ananias' directions afterwards that is stressed. Whereas in 22, it's really Ananias' directions afterwards that are stressed heavily. Here, it's not even mentioned. He talks about being obedient to the heavenly vision. And I think that has to do with what he says in verse 8 about the resurrection being, it shouldn't be incredible if God could raise the dead. His idea that a really key element is Jesus, the dead man that Festus was talking about, talking to him is at the cornerstone of all this. And then finally, I guess the other thing is that if you look at the connection, what he says to Agrippa about the prophets at the end in chapter 26 and verse, I lost the verse. I'm sorry. Let's see. I'm sorry, I lost it. Verse 23. Sorry. In 26:23, he really makes a strong appeal to Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 and Zechariah 12 in terms of the Christ was to suffer, and then especially this idea of proclaiming light to the Jewish people and the Gentiles really is straight out of Isaiah 49, and that's going to have a big impact on what he says to Agrippa about the prophets later in particular. And I don't know for sure whether that means that Agrippa's and Bernice's, for that matter, interest was centered around or they had special knowledge of the Old Testament prophets or not. But that was interesting to me too. So I think if you look at it, you've really got a very different audience, and that really plays out in all of this.
One thing, Tim, it's mentioned here is that Jesus spoke to him in Hebrew. That was the first time that was mentioned in the previous two.
Yep.
All right, so let's, with that as an introduction, let's kind of break it down, and we'll look at the first 11 verses where Paul is going to kind of recount his life before his conversion. And I like the way that you framed that. If we think of this as almost like a deposition, so he can go have his case before Caesar, it makes sense that he would talk like he does, based on the audience that he's got in front of him. So what did you guys notice in those first 11 verses?
Well, just one thing that he specifically is quoted as saying when he's talking to King Agrippa, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. He felt that, that he said he's fortunate. I feel myself fortunate to be before you. So again, referencing back to what you had informed us on, Stephen, about, King Agrippa and certainly him and his sister's knowledge of the Jewish way of living. So
It's kind of like in the previous time he has to give an account of his conversion. He also, in a similar way, says here in verse 5, like, I grew up learning and being a part of the most strictest party of our religion. He's talking about the Jewish religion, our shared religion. You know me, I grew up as a part of the strictest version of that. And now I'm here proclaiming that Jesus actually was the Son of God. I'm proclaiming this now. I'm not some crazy person. I actually was among the strictest part of our Jewish religion. And then as a Pharisee.
And the other thing I would just point out, just to piggyback on what Craig is saying there at the end, he also asked a very strategic question to Agrippa, given your knowledge of everything, basically, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? It's very strategic in the sense that he's making his case, and he's asking King Agrippa, if I get King Agrippa understanding this and he says yes, then all of a sudden I look pretty smart in the grand scheme of things. I mean, in the court of law, he's positioning himself very well, and it's a good setup, like Craig was talking about, and knowledge and who these people were. and then he asks the kind of the big question right on the front end of it. So
Another thing in this section that I think is pretty cool too is that he says, and now I stand here on trial because of my hope and the promise made by God to our fathers, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain. Just referencing the 12 all the way back to the beginning, the 12 tribes, there's a hope that we've been waiting for. And and that just happened. That was Jesus. And so we kind of, or at least I kind of overlooked the fact that if they say Jesus wasn't it, then they have to be looking out for someone else. And from what I read in the Bible, they're not actually looking out for anyone else. They're accusing and persecuting those that believe that Jesus was it. And it kind of goes back to that whole thing where it's almost easier to deny it and hold on to your pride and your position than to try and understand that I missed out on that promise when it was here.
Yeah, there's almost a little inside baseball there, Craig, on the fact that he talks about our 12 tribes, because it's like not everybody would have gotten that reference at all, because at this point the 12 tribes are pretty it's pretty difficult to tell anybody's from any tribe, particularly if they're not either a Levite or from Judah or Benjamin. It's awfully difficult to just pull out and say, oh, this guy's from Dan or Naphtali or something like that. So it's kind of one of those things. He's almost speaking to Agrippa and Bernice's knowledge of the Old Testament, just to even say our 12 tribes. I thought that was kind of interesting that he does that here. One thing that I wanted to point out, because Deborah said something really good about it, is at the very beginning, it's not a small thing that he says to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. This probably goes back to this idea of his being a Roman citizen, his ability to articulate that what he wants. The fact that he's able to speak for himself and not have a Roman represent him is probably more important than we recognize. Deborah said that not many people from this area are actually Roman citizens. Even in Rome, that was fewer than 60% of the population. In the area where Paul was, it's estimated something like 3% in the first century. So this is a very small community within a larger one of people who are like Paul that could make this defense, and were actually allowed to do so as a Roman citizen. Jim also points out that in that same verse 1, he stretched out his hand. He's preaching with dignity, not from a stance of just submission or whatever. He actually speaks as a speaker in front of the magistrate here. So a couple of really good comments.
All right. Any other thoughts in there? Well, let's get to verse 9, where we start looking at the persecution, 9 through 11. Why do you guys think that Paul would mention this? That he was a persecutor of Jesus? What's the point of that? And give you guys some time to think. Where it says Jesus of Nazareth, it's actually literally in the text. It's Jesus the Nazarene is what it says. And it's interesting the way that the disciples in the first century own that appellation. If somebody called you a Nazarene, it was like they called you a backwater bumpkin. It's not a compliment. The land where Nazareth is, the Galilee, is given as a gift to a king in the Old Testament. And the king's response is, "Why did you give this to me? It's worthless." And so that's kind of when you note that Jesus is the Nazarene. It's not as far as the world is concerned, that's not noteworthy. It's not a good thing. So I guess there's two questions there. Why do you think he did that? Why note that if it's so unnoteworthy? And why do you think Why do you think he feels it's a good thing to mention his past?
Is it possibly, Steve, Agrippa I, who was their father, had executed James, the apostle, and imprisoned Peter. So their family, over this period of time, had persecuted Christians. So was he drawing a line here to say, I used to do the same thing. I used to feel like you felt. I used to feel like your father felt. I used to feel like your grandfather felt. But when he tells him about his conversion and about the detail of what Jesus said to him in this accounting of it, and the purpose which goes into what everybody's already mentioned about the Gentiles, it just seems like that in this somewhere he's going to say, I used to be like you, and he says, I voted for the condemnation of these people. So I don't know whether was he a member of the Sanhedrin? Did he have an official vote where they cast the stones and the urns?
I don't know. Does anybody else know if he was actually a member of the Sanhedrin?
Because here he says down here in verse 10, I shut them up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So that was just a thought that came up in some of the things I read, that the Sanhedrin had a process by which they cast a pebble into one urn. If there was conviction, they cast it in another urn if they were acquitted.
Yeah, it's up. I've always thought that was the case, that he would have been a very, relatively speaking, a young member of the Sanhedrin. That's already pointed out in Acts when the whole thing with Stephen actually happens. But I think from this in particular, I think we gather that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. He's certainly been taught by some of the right people. I just wanted to make a point about the question of Jesus of Nazareth. Jim made a point about the historical accuracy maybe being part of it. He said it had been about 25 years since Paul persecuted Christians. Some present might have recalled this and would validate the charge would validate the change rather from meeting Christ on the road to Damascus. I also wondered a little bit, guys, if part of this isn't too that when he says Jesus of Nazareth, I think Joshua, Hosea, Jesus may have been a fairly common name. And certainly there were other Jesus or guys named Jesus that are involved even in the book of Acts. And I just wonder if maybe there's a certain level where he just feels like there needs to be an identifier in front of Agrippa in particular. I don't know.
Could be even a little deeper on the inside baseball too. I mean, a couple of things that come to mind too are one, he's not trying to build up Jesus, the Messiah, in some materialistic physical way. He's doing as Jesus lived. He's a lowly person from nowhere. But also in doing so, maybe saying of Nazareth, those in the audience that knew their prophets, that might remind them of, or they might be able to say, oh, here's why they're identifying this individual. It wasn't some warrior, some king. It was someone from some place where unexpected or something like that. And maybe a little bit of to help identify him with more detail, but also to say this is someone. Maybe they could tie the what the prophecies were trying to say and how they identified him, since they missed it the first time.
All right. We're going to have to move on to the next section so we can hopefully get through the end of 26. So Paul, in verse 12 through 8, this is where we actually get to the account of his conversion. So that's kind of his pre-Damascus life. What did you guys notice that you think is significant in verses 12 through 18? And while you're kind of collecting your thoughts, it would not have been weird for a Roman to hear that somebody had a vision. Today, the Enlightenment, that intellectual movement, really changed the way that we think about stuff like that culturally. Today, if somebody were to come up to you and say, I had a vision, you would think they're either speaking metaphorically or that maybe they got hit on the head a little hard or something. But here, for somebody to come and tell a Roman that I had a vision and it was one of the gods talking to me, Paul doesn't say that. Paul's the God. Jesus appears to me. But Roman religion is based upon visions and gods appearing and disappearing. And so none of this would have been weird necessarily for a Roman. Certainly not for Agrippa or Bernice, who seemed to be familiar with the Old Testament.
Well, it seems that when you read the account in verse 15, 16, and 17, it draws the narrative, the detail of the narrative that Paul gives a lot of credibility to the vision itself. When he speaks about the purpose he appeared to him for, that things that I have yet to reveal to you, that I will deliver you from the Gentiles to whom I send you, and the purpose that I'm sending you, and so forth. So it wasn't some sketchy vision. This was a recounting of a conversation, of an instructional conversation, an explanatory conversation that this Jesus had with him. So you go back to his background that he just talked about, the depths to which he persecuted Christians, to the degree that he went from city to city doing it. He was not a small bit player. He was a key player. And now here this is 180 degrees having a conversation or receiving a conversation from this Jesus that's detailing things that were to come and the purposes of them. So it's not some sketchy, it's nothing sketchy. I mean, everything he does here connects the dots exactly as to what he's saying and shows in a dramatic nature the transformation of him.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you go back to Acts chapter 9, Luke's recording of the events there and what Jesus said are almost like the abbreviated version of what he then explains, in chapter 26, what we just read. So to Daryl's point, even though it's not all detailed back in chapter 9, there was a very clear, specific message and purpose for Paul, who, at the time was called Saul. And I think we see Paul explaining that, in very good detail here for those, with whom he's on trial with.
The other thing that I would, this whole, the quote of, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. I've always loved that line, because it's like maybe he's even bringing this specific out at this time in this type of audience to say, I realized I had no choice but to believe, given the thing that I saw on the road to Damascus and the interaction that I had with the Savior. And I was clearly going against something that ultimately was wrong. And so I think for us, kicking against the goads doesn't resonate to the level that it might have for this particular audience. And to use this specific that he may not have used previously. Why did he pick this specific thing out to bring in at this time? It could have been for that very reason, to really say, look, this was something that ultimately I had to choose, given the truth that was before me. So I've always liked that phrase, kicking against the goads. Very detailed. If you know anything, if you've looked up anything about what a goad looks like and what it was used for in directing livestock.
I just come back in this to that last verse 18. And I just got to believe that Festus doesn't just say Paul's learning is driving him mad because what he says about resurrection. If you looked at verse 18 and you're Festus, or you hear what Paul's saying here in verse 18, and you're Festus, you've got, I mean, he's stringing together words, and all you know as Festus is he's stringing together words, because the whole idea of turning from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, receiving forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who've been sanctified by faith, this would have no meaning to most people who had heard nothing about what God had done for his people in the past. It's really interesting to think about this from Festus's point of view. I think it really kind of colors what we see later on if we think about it. That one verse is just nothing like somebody with a purely secular background would ever think about, and quite frankly, even today, it still hammers at people who don't have any kind of a biblical background.
And Tim, still today, when you bring things like this to somebody with no biblical background, before you have created any kind of common basis with them, usually they resort to sarcastic, demeaning criticism. And so this is what you see here. He wasn't interested in getting down in it and understanding it. He wanted to dismiss him, and he wanted to dismiss him sarcastically in front of Agrippa.
Yeah, I like verse 18 too. And that summarizes what Paul will say about his ministry in other places, that he is sent among the nations to bring about the obedience of faith. Well, that's pretty much what he just said. It's just a lot more descriptive. And I like the point you made, Tim, and Daryl, that if we drop biblical jargon into conversations with people who don't have the background and the depth of understanding for why that's important, you're not communicating. And that seems to ultimately be Festus's concern later is, Paul, you're saying a lot of words, but your words don't mean anything. I think that's a good segue into the next part, where it's almost like, I think maybe Tim mentioned this earlier, Paul seems to be focused on Agrippa and Bernice, in particular Agrippa. And all of that stuff Agrippa would have been familiar with. And so in 19, he just kind of picks him out. Therefore, O King Agrippa. And then he'll begin, let's just cover 19 down through verse 23, where Paul is going to talk about the prophets. He kind of repeats, he's going to the Gentiles so that they should turn to the Lord. And this is the reason why the Jews seized me. And so what do you guys think about this discussion where Paul is saying, look, I'm only saying that what the prophets promised happened. And why do you think that would have maybe resonated with somebody like Agrippa?
Well, he says down later on, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you do. So he knew enough about Agrippa to know that he was well versed in the old writings and had some level of belief in them. So I think he's working Agrippa because of what he knows about him.
If you're only pointing out what the prophets have said and know the audience is going to believe in that, and you tie this back into what he said in verse 8 of why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Again, it's like he's set this whole conversation up to really drive it home as to why he's in the right here, and he wants King Agrippa to acknowledge that, as well as acknowledge he should be defended for what he said.
Yeah, I think verse 23 is just so important here that he makes reference to very specific. I mean, Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 and Zechariah 12, references all to the idea of not only the suffering of Christ, but to his death and to the sorrow over his death and what they had done, and then to come back in in the latter part there and say, "Be the first to proclaim light." That's straight out of Isaiah 49. I mean, this is a sort of a greatest hits of the prophets, as it were, that he's just going to take those pieces and put them together, and then he's going to say, when Festus accuses him of being mad, he's going to say, "Do you believe the prophets?" Well, he says, I laid this out to you from the prophets. You know what I'm talking about.
I've always thought it interesting that since he is basically the last of the Herodian, basically an Edomite, that if he believes scripture and he believes prophecy, then he knows that as a people, they have many, several prophecies that are speaking directly to, the destruction and the justice being brought to Edom. So, and he's the last one. Well, he's the last king of that lineage. So I've always wondered what parts of prophecy he believed. Because, obviously, or maybe all of them, but he would know that there was the proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over Edom itself. So.
Yeah, Jim had a similar idea in that he just said, you look at God's purpose in this encounter, and you've got the highest Roman officials and the Idumeans, the highest officials in Israel literally are being exposed to the gospel through this trial. Paul understands what's happening here, and he's going to make the most out of it with everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a good lesson for us. The temptation would be in a legal deposition, if I'm in Paul's spot, to defend myself. And he does do that a little bit, but front and center is the gospel. And here he is. He's got an audience with a king that he knows is familiar with the Old Testament, at least a little bit. And so he preaches to the king. And so it's impressive.
For him to even mention Moses too, he mentions Moses in that same passage there as he mentions the prophets. So again, he's kind of guns a-blazing, so to speak, with his message, and he's got a great audience to do it with.
Yeah, Stephen, I think that's a good point. In the previous trial or deposition he's in, I think he does sort of defend himself. He takes an opportunity to actually kind of defend himself in a way, while he does also give his own account of his conversion and preach some too. But here, you're right. There's not a lot of defense. It's more of, here's my opportunity. I'm going to seize it, because this guy is a guy in power who has faith in God and has a belief in it. And if I can get him, that's more important. Now, obviously, if he does convert him, Paul may be completely set free, but I don't think that's the driving force here. His motivation is purely, I need to convert this guy. And probably God was working Paul up through that system in order to get him in front of him. And at least that's probably what Paul's thinking. I have to assume that.
That's a good segue to from 24 to the end of the chapter, where you have Festus cry out, "You're out of your mind." Paul's response is, "I'm speaking true and rational words," is the way the ESV renders it. Another way you could say that is, "I'm uttering words of truth and sobriety." In other words, I'm not crazy. And then he says, the king knows. Verse 26, we're right back to Agrippa. It's almost like he kind of pats Festus on the head and says, "Let the big boys talk." And so it's, without being rude or diminutive, that's kind of what he's doing. He's like, "No, I'm not crazy. You just don't understand where I'm coming from yet." And then he turns to Agrippa. And one of my favorite things is, this has not been done in a corner. You know, at that point, anybody could have stood up and said, "Paul is making all of this up. This is ridiculous." But it wasn't done in a corner. So what do you guys, in 24 to the end, what are some things that stand out to you?
Just from a writing perspective, and not that Luke was just writing this from his own head, I think this is what it was saying, but when Paul says, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains," that's straight out of a movie. It's just really awesome. I think the way he says it's, "I want you exactly like me." It's like, of course, they know he doesn't mean a prisoner, but he just adds that on at the end. "I want you to be like me, believe in Jesus, be saved, be bound for heaven through your faith and through what Jesus did for you while he was here on this earth. I wish everyone was just like me after they hear me today, except for what I have around my wrist that keep me bound here."
Debbie said Paul really does put Agrippa in a corner with this with this statement, with this question, "Do you believe the prophets?" "I know you do," because the implication is, if you believe the prophets, you know what I'm telling you is right. And it's how does Agrippa come back and deal with that? How does he say what he believes that he, or how does he say that he believed what the prophet said? How does he get out of it? What's he going to do? Please the Jews? Or how are the Romans going to react if he says that? I mean, Agrippa's really in a spot, if he's going to be honest with himself, he's really in a spot as to what to, and I'm sure what he said publicly is not like what he says privately to Festus afterwards.
Well, and he said it in front of Festus. And there's a great, I mean, you can say it, you can give tribute to Agrippa, given what his father was and what his grandfather was, that he was willing to declare that the guy was innocent. And Paul knew he was going to Rome because he'd been told over in 23rd chapter that he was going to Rome. So he knew he was going to Rome. But Agrippa said he was innocent. But the interesting thing to me would have been if there had been about 4 more verses and says, "Okay, Festus, now what are you going to write? As you send him forward, what's your message now? Do you understand any better? Have you got a better understanding, or do you want me to write it for you?"
Yeah, it is. I mean, to Tim's point, it is really interesting when you get to verse 27 that Paul doesn't say, "Do you believe in Jesus?" or "Do you believe in the resurrection?" He gets to a more fundamental core issue with King Agrippa, going back to the prophet. So that it is pretty fascinating to watch how this all unfolds, and then where where Paul, as others have perceptively said, puts King Agrippa in a corner. So it's a neat dialogue.
Yeah, it's interesting again, as we see throughout the biblical narrative, that you've got God using politics to accomplish his purpose. And so here we still have the Romans keeping Paul safe from the Hebrews. And, I've often thought before too that, maybe if Paul hadn't appealed, he would have been set free. But it's very likely that he wouldn't have lived long. And so God using the Romans to deliver Paul from the Hebrews, bring him to Rome. And then it gets a little fuzzy after what happens in Rome as far as history is concerned. But what God has purposed, God is providing, and we'll see that in the rest of the narrative that we have in Acts. Are there any other closing comments that you guys have? Any other thoughts?
It's just that last verse, Stephen, also really strikes me that it's almost, you can hear it like, well, he could have been set free if he hadn't appealed. Almost like, well, he should have done that. And, the response is from Paul's perspective, being set free was not his goal in that trial. Being set free was, the only thing that was his goal was to not be stopped from doing what the Holy Spirit wanted him to keep doing. I think that's a great message for us.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and we'll finish the live stream on Facebook and YouTube. So if you've joined us there, thank you. And we'll go ahead and we'll finish out, have some announcements and closing prayer. But thank you for joining us. And we'll be back next week.